Hello, and welcome to this HTAi 2020 virtual annual meeting plenary presentation. How to adapt HTAi to address the technologies that are disrupting health systems. As we wait a few minutes for further participants to join, I will share with you a few slides about the Society. The 2020 virtual programme includes oral, panel, plenary, poster, and workshop presentations being broadcast live throughout the rest of the year. The link to the full programme can be seen on the screen or accessed via the HTAi 2020 website. We'd like to take the opportunity to thank you for being a HTAi member and remind you that as a member you are invited to join one or more of the HTAi interest groups. The groups provide a unique environment for HTAi members to network, exchange information, and to collaborate on projects throughout the year. To learn more or to join a HTAi interest group, please see the interest group tab on the HTAi website. As we deliver our 2020 annual meeting, we would like to acknowledge the continuing support of our sponsors. Participants throughout this plenary session will remain muted. There is time set aside for Q&A following presentations from the panelists. To submit your questions, please use the questions functionality on the GoToWebinar control panel. This may look like either of the two images shown on the screen, depending on whether you have joined through the app or a web browser. Thank you again for joining us today. I will now hand over to Professor Gillian Leng for a formal welcome and to introduce today's topic and panelists.
Thank you, Denise. Really pleased to be chairing this panel today. I'm Gillian Leng. I'm the Chief Executive of NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And this session is really relevant to the work we do at NICE, looking at how we adapt our health technology assessment methods to new types of technologies that are disruptive to the health system. So these are things that may overturn existing clinical practice. So we're talking about things like gene therapies and tissue engineered therapies. And we're probably familiar with some of the examples, such as CAR T therapies for cancer and maybe preventive treatments in the future for Alzheimer's disease. And typically these technologies are things that can be given as a one shot, if you like, a one-shot expensive treatment, and you have to offset that against a more traditional regime, which might have been a lifelong regime of an alternative treatment. So having this one-shot cure potentially tests the existing HTAi paradigm. So the plan for this session is to give us all some insights into what this might mean and to discuss some of that between us, covering things like methodological uncertainties, how we might collaborate better between HTAi agencies and how that might help, things like the role of horizon scanning systems so we can see more clearly what's coming to down the track and how we might handle it, and the role of the patient voice, really important in all of this. So I'm really pleased to be chairing this. As I said, it's of key importance to NICE. NICE is currently undergoing a review of our methods, so it's very timely. And I'm really pleased to be here with three great speakers. We have Dr. Wong Riga, who's chair of the Rare Disease International, and is going to talk to us about patient and citizen perspective. We have Dr. Chen, head of medical affairs at Takeda in China, and Professor Bucafero, who's president of the Italian National Institute of Health, and going to talk about commissioning and accreditation. So we're going to kick off in a moment, and we will get through the three presentations first, and then have a round of questions at the end. And you can enter your questions at any point, and we'll pick them up later. So first off then, please, Dr. Dehan Wong Riga, over to you, and the rest of us will disappear from the screen.
Thank you very, very much, Jillian, and it's such a great pleasure to be here. I am Durhan Wong Rieger. I have a variety of hats. I'm president and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, but also chair of Rare Diseases International, which is an international alliance of rare disease organizations as well as international rare disease groups. I also sit as vice chair of the Asia Pacific Alliance of Rare Disease Organizations and have a variety of other roles within IRDIC, the International Research Consortium on Rare Diseases, and also as treasurer of the United Nations NGO Committee on Rare Diseases. And it's my great pleasure to talk about HTAi, and the title I think I recently saw was around disruptive technologies, and we'll talk a bit about it from that perspective. So part of what was really throwing me when I first saw this, obviously from a patient perspective, was trying to figure out what was being disruptive. And I appreciate the clarification that it's disrupting the health systems, because it really isn't necessarily that patients would see these therapies as disruptive, but certainly see them in a much more, I think, positive kind of a light. Instead. But I think it was worthwhile for me to go back and ask the question, can disruptive theory, though, actually guide access to innovative therapies? Important to know that certainly not all what disruptive innovation is not. So not every novel therapy is innovative, obviously. That is, it doesn't necessarily improve efficiency, effectiveness, or competitive edge. Not even every innovative therapy is a breakthrough. That is, it will provide a substantial improvement over existing therapies. Certainly, even as patients, we know that not every breakthrough therapy is a disruptive innovation, and not every disruptive innovation is actually going to be disruptive everywhere. In some places, yes, not. So important to know that disruption is not a product or a service, it's actually a process. And under traditional disruptive theory, disruptive theory, it really means that it's a way which we can actually bring in more products or services in a way that's going to be available to primarily those who are unserved or underserved, by bringing in what would be smaller, lower price entrants to markets that are not necessarily getting things in existing markets. So it would be patients that are not actually covered in an existing market, or it may be a market, a low middle income country, where there is not coverage at the moment. But as these entrants come in at a lower price, they actually provide, obviously, a great uptake for some of these environments. And then as they are more accepted, and maybe as their quality improves, as their experience becomes more known, they actually begin to replace the major products, the existing, in this case, brand products. And in fact, they themselves may be able to become better. So interestingly, biosimilars to me was an interesting example of unlikely example of a disruptive technology. Now, it's not disruptive when it actually comes in as a competition to the regular drugs. And for many patients, this is a bit of a challenge, because it does come in at times positioned against the brand. And if clinicians or patients are not familiar with the new entrants, there may be some suspicions as to whether or not it works as well. There's a lot of reluctance to switch. And in fact, when some environments have brought in mandatory switching or substitution, there's also been a pushback, creation of suspicion, resentment, and in some cases, non-compliance. So in this case, disruptive theory does not really hold. It is not a way in which we can bring this in a way that's going to supplant the existing product. Where it has been disruptive is actually in low and middle income countries, or in, as we said, markets where there are not, there are some patients who are not being well served. So what we can do then is, we've seen in many countries where these do come in, they are in fact quite welcome. They're in fact able to provide products to patients who are not yet being served by the biologics. And over time, they become more accepted within a population and may move into the already covered patients, and over time will spread from the lower middle income environments, the underserved environments, into the more major environments. And as we've seen over time, as many will know, they themselves begin to improve, begin to challenge the brands on some of the improvements that have been made, such as slow release products or having subcutaneous infusions, home infusions, as opposed to clinic. So they begin to take on the same kind of added benefits as the original brands, and in that case become well established, providing a service to both the underserved, originally underserved, and to the existing markets. I think for us, the real question is, can we get widespread access to these transformative therapies then that are disrupting, as we might say, normal access products? And I think just to say, on the same page, is that a transformative therapy, much as I think we're talking about these new therapies, or those that are, as Jillian said, a single intervention, short-term course, usually having a significant potential for substantial and sustained health benefits, and theoretically extending throughout a patient's lifetimes. Obviously something that could be highly, highly desirable. Challenger, of course, are how are these therapies perceived by stakeholders? Certainly from patients' point of view, they're highly desirable. They're therapies for life, long-lasting cures, better quality of life. And as we're looking at more and more personalized therapies, especially in the cancer space and the rare disease space, they actually are going to be able to serve highly, highly individualized needs, hopefully improving the not only health outcomes, but also quality of life. Clinicians, we find that we have been a bit more concerned, because oftentimes it means redesigning how you provide your clinical care. Who actually is going to be the key provider? There's a huge necessity for benefit risk consultations, also raising the need for lifelong monitoring. Do we have the systems in place in order to be able to do that? And what if this supposedly lifelong therapy doesn't work? Is there an option for retreatment? And as troubling, is there an option for going back to the original therapy? So these are certainly key concerns, and certainly ones that clinicians need to be able to talk to the patients about. I mean, from an HTAi perspective, I think we've found, and certainly in the few cases where we've had access to some of these therapies, the huge problem, of course, is the data uncertainty. And that makes it very challenging under traditional HTAi models to come out with any kind of a cost effectiveness assessment. Often what we're getting, I say often as if there are many of them, certainly in our environment in Canada, we've only had 2 or 3 that are coming through. They're conditional recommendations, and they're highly, highly conditional upon pricing and the limited use. And of course, as we know, for our payers, whether they're public payers or private payers, the biggest concern is in terms of the budget impact, especially if the pricing is going to be done in a one-time shot. The other problems, of course, as we know, for us, is the fact that these healthcare costs are often siloed. Certainly in Canada, in many developed countries, the drug budget may be siloed off from the other healthcare budgets. Even so, if there's a reduction in terms of lifelong healthcare or even immediate hospitalization cares, this is a huge impact. Sometimes these therapies come in, though, with also additional healthcare costs, so the budgets are not going to be necessarily available in the health systems themselves, and this makes it really difficult. And for many payers, and certainly in Canada, again, the option of dispersed payments or linked to pay for performance, we don't necessarily have the systems that are allowing us to have some certainty that we can manage that. So that means some huge changes. So are there changes needed? Maybe. Policy frameworks that break down budget silos, looking at pricing models. Many of these therapies are for very, very small numbers of patients, so it's not necessarily a huge budget impact. What about these multi-year agreements? What about pay for performance? And then having frameworks, HTAi methodologies that can handle uncertainty, that are able to look at long-term patient outcomes. And obviously a huge need for infrastructure changes so that we've got the patient monitored, the data sharing, drug reassessments. So it's not just the idea that, okay, we've got these therapies, and certainly from a patient perspective, highly desirable. I think we all are very cognizant that it means major impact in terms of the system, and probably a good thing that they're coming in very slowly, one at a time. What are these therapies and how are they disrupting? In some respects, of course, disruptive therapies are not necessarily just gene therapies or cellular therapies. Combination of expensive therapies are really a challenge for patients in terms of getting access. And we're finding many of our systems are not able to make the kind of assessment and provide the kind of approvals that we need because they're combining several drugs, some of which had been very hard fought to get into the original formulary or reimbursement, and now the recommendation is that there would be combinations of them, sometimes 2 therapies. And in the case with cystic fibrosis, now 3 therapies, each one of them that are considered to be breakthroughs on their own. Obviously, we're talking about potential durable therapies with a single high price. Interestingly enough, where some of these therapies are getting better tractions is where there are existing therapies, as opposed to the concerns around the entry for these gene therapies where there isn't anything to compare to. So a new entry gene therapy for a spinal muscular atrophy, where we already have a lifelong therapy that requires continuous administration, may actually be perceived by the system as much cheaper than the ongoing administration, even though the one-time price is high, as opposed to a gene therapy maybe for sickle cell disease, where currently there aren't any therapies. So the cost for a single gene therapy might be perceived as extraordinarily high compared to the current price, where there is very, very little available. There's also the disruption, obviously, but there's also transformative therapies that we look at from a patient perspective that may be high quality of life, but not necessarily increase efficacy or safety. And again, we get a lot of pushback certainly from traditional HTAi that says there's no added benefit, there's no added safety, but from a patient point of view could be significant if you're talking about an oral therapy versus an infusion therapy. You're talking about something that like the non-invasive glucose monitor, and certainly if we're talking about being able to have home infusion versus having to go regularly into a unit. So subcutaneous may be seen as a huge benefit for the patient, but may have a lot of difficulties when you're looking at just increased efficacy or safety. And then also we're now talking about some preventive therapies. These are therapies that we're getting now that may reduce the need for, and in a COVID area, we're highly sensitive to, for fewer transfusions, for fewer relapses, so that you don't have to be in hospital. So we've got, therapies for thalassemia now that may increase the time between blood transfusions, for hemophilia, which is going to reduce the need for actual blood recombinant therapy, and certainly the need now in treatments for like sickle cell disease, which may reduce pain crises, reduce the need for hospitalization, reduce transfusions. All of these, from our point of view, are transformative therapies that we're finding having great difficulty managing, being managed by the traditional HTAi methodologies. So just very quickly to say, just want to give you a quick example of something that we think has been a very interesting one, is the world's first gene therapy, Glybera, and what's gone on as a good example, at least initially. So Glybera is a product for lipoprotein lipase deficiency, LPLD. It's an ultra-rare genetic disease. There's a missing protein so that patients can't process dietary fat. They have very high triglycerides. The biggest concerns, of course, are the accumulation of the fat in the blood, especially when it attacks the liver and the pancreas, where you get very painful attacks of pancreatitis. And the symptom management is a very strict, very low-fat diet. We know these patients, and of course, quality of life for these patients is extremely difficult. Even adherence to the diet may not avoid pancreatitis. First gene therapy was discovered by a Canadian researcher, and this was quite a major deal. And in fact, became the first gene therapy to be approved in Europe. We had very successful clinical trials that seemed to be a highly effective kind of therapy, approved then by EMA, but they had a huge requirement for post-market monitoring studies with an enrollment of additional patients. The problem was that it was launched and the company set a $1.2 million one-time upfront price tag. Very, very difficult to market. Very small company, did not have the kind of, we believe, on the ground kind of support to market the drug. It was, in fact, if one had done an HTA on it, could have been deemed as highly, highly cost effective, because based on the 6 years outcomes data that they had, it was actually going to be less per annum over the 6-year period than most other orphan drugs. Unfortunately, it was being marketed with that one-time upfront price. In 2017, the company withdrew the drug, saying that it would cost too much for them to actually renew the license. So this was gone. The problem is that there's no alternative. The most recent attempt to have an alternative, Waylivra, has not actually been successful. It's not a gene therapy. It's only going to reduce the symptoms, not necessarily having the same kind of a one-time, lifelong kind of a benefit. The FDA said they were much concerned. In fact, concerns with the reduced platelet levels leading to bleeding. EMA gave it an additional approval. NICE has now rejected it, as saying it's not cost effective. The cost is too high relative to the benefits. So for these patients, there is still no recourse. Right now, we have in Canada the possibility of maybe a rescue. We have a new program under the Canada's National Research Council called, interestingly enough, the Disruptive Technology Solutions for Cell and Gene Therapy. They've actually decided to pick up the drug, and they're going to package it in a new viral vector, in which case they can bypass the patent problems. They're hoping that being able to re-engineer Glivera using a publicly funded manufacturing product could actually allow us to have a product that could be much, much less expensive, and maybe be able then to bring this back into the market. So we shall see what happens. It will still be a good number of years before this can be demonstrated. So another alternative is, can public funders actually provide these drugs, public payers provide these drugs? Second, a quick case study, though, is CAR T-cell therapy. And in fact, this is an interesting notion of how I think disruptive theory does come back. I mean, CAR T, as you will know, is in fact a T-cell therapy where we remove the cells from the patient. In this case, for B-cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the cells are re-engineered, re-administered back to the patients, and in theory, provides them for actually a cure. It is a very high-priced therapy. Plus, of course, there is the hospitalization procedure and ongoing long-term treatment costs. In many developed countries, though, it's been well approved, including in the Canada environment for the Canadian HTAi agency, who recommended access, but only with obviously price reductions. What made it, I think, quite easily acceptable was that it was marketed to a very narrow group of patients, those that are unresponsive to or with multiple relapses following chemo and bone marrow transplant. The question for us, of course, is, can it be expanded to other patients? Will it be able to become a first-line therapy? Certainly at this point, because it is being made available only to those patients who are not being able to be served by the current regime, it is deemed to be quite acceptable. In Canada, in fact, we're taking it one step further, where we've got the laboratories, and again, back to a public health option, where they're making their own CAR T cells and hoping that with the that this will actually be able to reduce the cost and to make the program more broadly available. And again, the question is, can it be moved upstream to patients who do not necessarily have to go through the chemo or the bone marrow? I mean, we see it clearly from the patients. This is a much, much preferred treatment, even with the concerns about lifelong immunosuppression. But again, we will have to see. But a good combination of carefully targeted accessibility, as well as the option for being able to pick up some of the production through public funding. Luxturnative, of course, I'll give quickly as a last case study in terms of how the systems are being able to make available these therapies, has been recommended by NICE, which we're quite thrilled to see. And it's almost, we think, was because of, or in spite of, some HTAi cost effectiveness assessment. So Novartis, received approval from NICE for the acceptance of it. What we found very exceptional was the fact that Luxturna, just to say quickly, is the first gene therapy for for a retinal condition that could lead to blindness. It is available only for a very, very small subset, again, for patients who have a double gene, who are double allele a dysfunction, and it will usually start in childhood or adolescence and can progress to complete blindness. The impact in terms of these patients has been absolutely miraculous. The FDA gave a priority review, breakthrough therapy designation, orphan drug status, and certainly the patients have been quite strong in terms of their advocacy for it. Two different reimbursement schemes that came up, and I think, again, a way in which we can get these therapies in from a nice perspective. They recognized it in terms of a high unmet need, a real change in terms of management. They noted the fact that it was the first gene therapy of a randomized control trial, which they noticed as maybe a model for others. For us, and certainly from a patient perspective, what we had not heard before was the notion that, look, we will take 40 years duration, which is what the, when we're talking about children and adolescents, this therapy could last for up to 40 years. And even though we're finding it uncertain, we don't think it's unreasonable, and which we think makes it then very much so cost effective and well within NHS highly specialized technologies. Different solution comes from the US, the Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, which actually said, look, we will do it on a pay for performance. It will be the first outcome-based contract for gene therapy. It's not their first outcomes-based contract, but it was the first time to be applied here. What allowed them to do was spread the payments over a good number of years, so there was a reduction in both the risk and the financial burden for the overall cost. And because the payments are tied to both short and longer term site outcomes, they were able to, they will be able to continue payment on the basis that they're getting the outcomes that they need with very clear outcome measures. And they're also being able to pay their centers for these specialized treatments. So again, two different solutions with both, I think, that being able to accommodate in, which is a very highly important therapy, but certainly could have huge disruption to the system. The last thing I just want to mention is that the only alternatives we're finding to having some novel and appropriate HTAi systems is what's happening in many cases where we've got patients who are turning to, families who are turning to GoFundMes, either in terms of access to the therapies, which are highly, highly expensive, or in some cases trying to develop highly personalized gene therapy on an individual case basis. This is obviously not the most effective way, and in fact, not a long-term appropriate way in terms of funding the healthcare system. So we do need to have, I think, our systems all step up to be able to provide that. I'll just give some very quick concluding thoughts. Disruptive theory could, in fact, be a pathway for transformative therapies, especially for unresponsive or relapsing patients. So using that philosophy does work. Non-innovative therapies could also explore this disruptive pathway, and certainly, again, biosimilars is an option. Improved quality of life drugs could also think about this. The traditional HTAi cost effectiveness could yield some useful ICER and recommendations if, like NICE, they accept the notion of a reasonable assumptions of curative durability. Obviously, you're not going to have to prove for 40 years outcomes, but if one can extrapolate from the mode of action and also from what would be a reasonable extrapolation, it does help us in terms of getting to an appropriate recommendation. Dispersed financing instead of that one-time upfront to very high price. Pay for performance. Obviously, we're sharing. We're doing this already with many of our managed access schemes for certainly for the rare disease drugs. And where there's high uncertainty. And again, as we say, we will need this approach not just for these curative therapies, but if we're going to continue with the path of ultra-orphan, more personalized therapies and certainly customized therapies, all of these are going to require some modifications in our HTAi models that would take into consideration so many other factors, including the way in which our healthcare system is in fact structured. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a really great start, and you did a fantastic job of taking us through the complex issues, and the examples really brought it to life. So that was fantastic. We move on now to the second presentation, and I hope you're there, Dr. Chen, ready to talk to us from an industry perspective about discovering, manufacturing, and regulation. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, the HTAi, the intervention, invitation me and Gillian introduced. Thank you for your time. Now we are based in Shanghai, working for the Takeda based in Shanghai. So medical field, prior than Takeda, working the BMS for the optimal promotion in China. The new indication expanded in China. Prior the BMS also working 9 years in the Pfizer. So my background is oncologist. So I'm highly interested in how to use and CAR-T and CAR-NK to treatment the patient in the solid tumor and knowledge and tumor. So now I'm very happy to take the minutes to introduce the CAR-NK compared to CAR-T. Next slide, please, Danny. Because the Dennis and the control my slides may be a little delayed from a screen. Hello, Dennis, can you hear me? Maybe some technical trouble.
We need the slides moving forwards, I think, don't we? Is that right?
Okay, so I can find my slides here. Okay, we don't because they're on the way. So, oh. Dennis, can you help me to present the slides now?
Your slides are visible to the audience.
And I think he wants to move them on.
Okay, perfect. So, okay, because I can find the slides on the screen. And okay, yes, thank you. It is everything goes well. I'll present to you in terms to the mechanism and the actions and the CAR-NK. You know, compared to the CAR-T, there's a lot of advantage in here. Number one is virtual virus used to introduce a new gene to the NK cell. Derived from the anogenics and the cord blood. That is a very key point, a difference from the CAR-T. A second one is CD90 is added to increase in the CAR-NK specificity for B cells malignancies. That is as another modified in here. So we can target perfect. I can find the slides in here. So the interleukin 15 is added to prolong the visibility of NK cell and their receptions. So that is a good point in here. Another one is CRISPR9, based on the suicide chain, is introduced to allow to triggering and the apoptosis of anogenic NK cell if required after infusions. So another key point is a cord blood often offers the attractive anogenic and offer share the results of the NK cell. So they can compare with the CAR-T. So share of share is a very critical point in here. NK cells can be highly toxicity in effect and killing the targets in the the antigen specific manner. Without causing to the graft versus and host disease. The characteristic might be able to overcome some the drawbacks for current available in the CAR-T therapy and here, because the FDA have approved 2 CAR-T in India here. Now in future, CAR can maybe overcome some drawback for CAR-T in here. Currently available data is primary data from our ongoing the first in human trial has been shown response in the patient with their relapse and refractory B cell malignancies, no signal of several cytokine release symptom and neurotoxicity. So here is available data here. In the future, we'll focus on the phase 1 and phase 2 data to address the dosage and safety and the relevant efficacy, the CAR-NK, and Takeda internally named as Takeda 007 in the patient. Patients will be focused on the relapse and refractory and the CD19 positive B cell malignancies. Next slide, please. So compared to the CAR-T and the CAR-NK, we are listing the 7 elements and compare with the CAR-T and the CAR-NK cell in here. CAR-T is adaptive immune system, and compared with the NK is a native immune system. So the target and the T cell is okay, and here CD3 and the CD4 and the CD3 and the CD8 positive. For the NK is CD196 positive here. From the CAR-NK is differentiated from the bone marrow. It's easy to gather. No antigen primer here, primer there, primary in the blood in the here. No or low risk the graft versus in the host disease. So that is 7 the key point differentiation with CAR-T, the T cell in here. Next slide, please. In the normal cell, the hereditary and signal triggered by the key KRR, the HLA1 molecular and engagement overrides attractiveness here. That means in the normal situation, the CAR-NK will not key the normal cell because the managed by the hereditary signal. In the lung cancer situation, different situations are totally different. Next slide, please. In the context of cancer, express of address ligand, for the acting receptor in the conjugate with low express of the HLA1 molecular annotate the triggering the here in hereditary and receptor and result in the acting signal. So in this situation, NK can be kill the cancer cells. Next slide, please. So that depends on the Ahmed Anderson and the Katie, Professor Katie, the clinical trial. They total prepare the CAR-NK in the first in human phase 1 and phase 2 study. Total I need to the 2 weeks, 15 days. One the day 15, they can prepare the NK cell transduction, the NK cell with retrobacteria and vector to prepare to generate anti-specific CAR-NK. The CAR-NK positive and the cell in here. In the day 9, after the late chemotherapy, expanding the CAR-NK cell in here, patients will be prepared and performs the lymphodepleting chemotherapy with the chemo regimen. That ensures the patient is prepared well in the day 4 and day 3 and the day 2. Then the day 0. And the cell infusions, different dosage and treatment of the patient. The 3 dosages I have prepared here. So next slide, please. That is prepare for totally prepare to treatment. Next slide, please. This data has a publication in the New England Journal of Medicine in the February. So the title is use a CAR transduced and neutral killer cell in the CD19 positive lymphoma tumor. Here is the Kitty, Professor Kitty is developing. That is the sponsored by Moose Shorter efforts to natural killer cell. At the moment, the Takeda has signed an agreement with MD Anderson and to co-develop the CAR-NK, ensure that can be used and the get approved from major the agency and benefit for the patients. So the next slide, please.
And I think we want one more on, Denise, don't we? One more.
Okay, a moment. One more. So I have shown the publication in New England Journal of Medicine here. We are go to the more detail for the safety profile and efficacy in here. For the based on the publication, phase 1 phase 2 study, patient the characteristic in here. Totally 15 patient enrollment because the another issues withdraw than 4 patients. Totally 11 patient analysis and treated by the CAR-NK. The aggressive lymphoma is 9, and one FL patients 1, and CLL patients 5. So here list the all total patient characteristics taken in here. 7 from male and 4 from female. Average age is 16 years, ranging from 47 to 70. For the midline prior treatment, all the patients they get the treatment prior treatment, chemotherapy, another treatment from the very later stages in here. Now range from 3 and to 11. Okay, totally median follow up. The time is 30.8 months. Range from 2.8 to 20. So that is key information from the patient characteristic. And next slide, please. So here, now data is very promising here. From in terms to table 2, they show the cytokine release lymphoma is 0. Graft versus host disease is 0. And neutral, yes, and then here neutral toxicity is 0. So for in terms to hematological events, neutropenia, and here, and grade 4 is 8, grade 3 is 2. And the grade 1 is 1. Thrombocytopenia in the grade 1, the grade 1 or 2 is 8. Grade 3 is 0, and the grade 4 is 0. So anemia, the grade 1 is 7. Grade 3 is 2. Grade 4 is 0. So in terms to safety profile, it is very good and promising. Now in terms to the publication data, maximum tolerable dose is not reached. That means we can increase in dose in here. I want to address this point is cytokine release symposium is 0, neutral toxicity is 0, and the GV and the H disease is 0. That is a totally different from CAR-T and show their safety profile. Next slide, please. So here slides show the efficacy and the response to CAR-NK for 11 patients here. This slide lists all the patients, the efficacy in here. I just mentioned summary and the key point here. ORR response rate, overall response rate is 73%. That means 11 patients, 8 patients have a response rate. Include that 7 CR. So very promising and the data here. Response within the first month. so that can quickly respond after the infusion, the current K and patients, current K. Next slide, please. So this data, they show the patient, they finally achieve the complete response in the CL with Richard transformation. The data, the radiotherapy as well, show the primary administration after the current K day 30, all the dismissed. Patients get the totally complete response. So next slide, please. This data also publication New England Journal of Medicine in February. If you're highly interested, you can check the original data and then here. So I would like to summary the study and here opportunity, high response rate, and mentioned ORI is 78%, and highly treatment patient rapidly response after the 1 month and 4 weeks, all the dose level, very favorable safety profile without clinical relevant and mentioned the CRR, neutral toxicity, or the GVHD and here. Long term, the in vivo persistent in NK. That is, if I get the one treatment, everything can be completed. The last one is a possibility for the off-the-shelf application because there is cord blood from NK cell. That is a benefit to the manufacturers. They reduce the price and can be benefit more on the patient. I mentioned the B cell malignancies. So these studies and the limitation here, low patient number, because I need more patient can prove the concept. If the B cell lymphoma patients can be benefit that, can be expanded to some solid tumor here. Next slide, please. So here I would like to summary the current K in the Takeda and named as the HTAi 77007 unique compared to another therapy in here. One is manufactured from modified NK cell derived from a cord blood. That is a key point here. Analogic and frozen allow to shave offer for shave a global point of care distribution. So the third one is was no association with development and the cytokine released a simple neutropenia and the graph versus in the host disease. So last one is a very promising response rate in the here, 73% in their relapse and factory and disease. So okay, that's our presentation. Briefly introduce and high level to your current care and the current situation and the futures. Back to and host Glenn Lin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Chen. Great to hear the theory behind the treatments, and that scan that you had towards the end showing a dramatic response after 30 days was really quite impressive. So moving on now to Professor Brusaferro, who's going to talk more about the commissioning and policy and planning end of new therapies. So I'm hoping you're there, and we're aiming to have about 15-20 minutes at the end for questions. So over to you.
So thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is it okay?
Yes, we can. Yeah, we can hear you and we can see you.
Okay. Can you see also the slides full screen?
Yeah, slides are there. Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning to everyone and to everybody, and thank you very much to you and to all the organizers for inviting me to participate, to contribute to this plenary session. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to try to contribute to the discussion you just tried to afford with this topic. My next 15 minutes, I would like to go through three topics. The first one is some, thought about healthcare evolution and what SARS-CoV-2 is contributing to this kind of evolution. Please remember that I'm a public health professional, I'm a public health doctor, so my perspective of my speech would be more focused on the public health perspective. The second point is about digital revolution and then the impact on healthcare. And finally, some issues that HTAi has to face with according to the revolution in the healthcare and digital evolution. Starting from the first point, I would just try to summarize some keywords that probably most of you knew very well. And these were some of the topics that were reported almost all over the world in the agenda for the trends in healthcare model. And there is something about integration, the critical or the key words between social service in healthcare and literacy of the citizen and communities is another relevant issue to how we have to face with pathways and the impact of the new drugs and new technology in the pathways, and as well as the multi-professional and multidisciplinary approach that is needed according to the needs of the people overall for chronic care. And the other thing is the integration of ICT in the ecosystem and the accessibility of ICT to our people. And then there are some requisites that are requested for almost all technology or all services. And, there are many of them, accessibility to quality and safety, that are very famous. And then, of course, also reduction of waste, that is a very important issue. This is a perspective how the healthcare is moving about with data available, and then just try to show that I think these images are very suggesting about evolution, and this is that the fact that we move from the healthcare platform, let's say, to the patient-centered healthcare ecosystem. And this is a great evolution that has, of course, many positive things, but as we will see in few slides, also some limitation. Then there is a sort of attempt of the healthcare of the governments. I'm just moving now, showing you the plans from European Union about the recovery from after SARS-CoV-2, and I think this is another issue very much important. So as how this epidemics is impacting on the planning of healthcare system. As you can see, there are a lot of investment in healthcare program, as well as in innovation, and also in aspect about quality of life, wellness, and of course ICT. Emerging issues that some of the emerging issues that are just proposed and put in the immediate agenda overall for the G7, G20, all these kind of meetings that will take place in the next months. We have some topics to face with. The first one is the preparedness. And of course, this preparedness means that for every new technology, every new drugs, you have to provide training for a healthcare professional to be flexible in the way to adopt them. And one very critical point is also the redundancies. The lean production or the model that were very effective, that were focused on effectiveness, on avoiding redundancies to reduce costs, as shown during this pandemic, that have some critical aspects. And so some part of the redundancies, the cost of them probably are necessary to guarantee the buffer of mask reagents, diagnostic tools, as well as drugs in case of pandemic. The other one is the attention that public health and prevention have at the moment. And of course, they are very well known about their contribution to health and to health of our community. But this kind of experience we are living all over the world is just showing that it's very much important to adopt to have in mind the community perspective, and this is as a consequence, there is a need to strengthen prevention programs and, of course, resources. At the same time, the local coordination is very much important. Another issue is very much important. I think that will address most of the programs of the initiative to manage fragile patient and elderly is to rethink some social models we afford these people. And so the mix of contact persons about empathy and people living close to these people, going every day to see them, but at the same time technology to support the monitoring of these fragile people is a mix of I try to call it exoskeleton, but it's a sort of an approach trying to put together technology and personal contact. Technology is another issue. We will see in few slides and have some example, but ICT and what is called Society 5.0 is some of the horizons that we have to consider and to move our technology considering this kind of linkages. And finally, human resources is a central issue, but most importantly, I would like to stress the problem of infodemic that is affecting, of course, it's very clear how to survive infodemic together with the epidemic. And but also in HTAi programs and fake news or other issues that can be voluntary or involuntary are a challenge we have to consider. Digital evolution, I would like to start from a digital divide, because accessibility to new drugs, new programs, new technology, or the mix of them, as most of the products or services are going to be in the next month, the next year, have a premise that is people can have equal access, or they have no differences in the access to these tools. And digital divide is one of them. And I showed just a picture about the European Union that showed that as the household with internet access is very different among countries, and if we go deeper, looking at by region, the map would be even more differences. And this is very much an important issue in the perspective of guaranteeing equal and equity to people. Then we have, many of this kind of tools that can disrupt our system. And the most important thing is that probably you have not to consider them as a single devices making a single disruption, but as in most of the programs or project in development, there are a mix of them working together. And so disruption should be considered as putting together some of them with traditional tools and trying to understand exactly what's going on, what will come out from this experience. This revolution brings also some ethical challenges that should be discussed at scientific level, but also political level. And then the first one is selling or sharing data. That is not indifferent in the way we manage data. The thing that we are personalized in some way, but at the same time we need this kind of data in a community perspective. It is not easy sometimes to reconcile this kind of contradiction. And then there is a precision medicine that is another issue that should be considered, and also to nudge people. And also the pandemic is showing that like the apps for tracing people, positive people in strict contacts, are very debated according to the different mechanism of provided within each country. And the other thing is to guarantee the privacy, anonymity versus precision, and this kind of data, this kind of dialectic, it can be contradictory, it can be a contradiction, and we should attentively focus our attention on that. And this will be also one of the criteria you have to consider in looking and in evaluating new products or new services. We have some example. This is a WHO, it's not really recent, that was released some months ago, last year, and it's trying to evaluate the impact of digital intervention to strengthen health system. But it's quite a good approach to consider to start a systematic evaluation of the system. And of course, the other one is the perspective, looking at the new medical devices, that this is a projection into 2030, and but these will be included in the network. And what the Japanese call Society 5.0 is a sort of horizon where all these devices, probably medical devices, will be included. And if we consider that some of them will be part of a system of organization of a service that include devices together with drugs or together with medical or nursing intervention, it's very much important to have this kind of perspective. Some issue to face with. The first issue is, I think that looking at new services, new drugs, is the value. And value is a consideration that as a general agreement in a scientific society, or societies, of course, but values can be divided in different axes, like locative, technical, personal, societal values should be considered. And so we have to split the term, the value into different sub-axes in the consideration, in the evaluation of the new system. The other one is the way the age, digital divide by age and by literacy. I have no time to show you data on the literacy, the impact of literacy in the usage of devices, of internet, of ICT tools. And of course, as we know, the way that age is as different ages have different approach. They use different tools. They have different possibilities and literacy in order to use at the best the tools or the services that we can provide them. And this is another issue that has to be considered, both in terms of research and implementation. Another one is the topic about trust. Trust is something is going to be very, very much important in the contact between science and people, between doctors and physicians, or pharmacists, or scientists and people. And also the trust between artificial intelligence and the new tools, new ICT tools and people. Without this, it can be very, very difficult. And we know that also at the moment, speaking about vaccine, about other issues, and the pandemic is showing, the negationist of people saying that the pandemic is not existing, is quite an epiphenomenon that we should consider, we should study, and we should include in the models and the communication model. We provide we support and we release the new technology to people. Another issue is that innovation is one part of the system, but then we have the complexity. What does it mean, this innovation within a system? How does it impact on the system and the evolution? And of course, how do we implement the science is another issue very much important. Because, in some, we know we have good data showing that the implementation and adoption of the new technology, even if they are demonstrated scientifically or supported by scientific evidence, very strong scientific evidence, the way they are implemented throughout the country is sometimes has a very, very long delay as a long timeline. The Rogers cycle can be an example, but the other thing is complexity science and healthcare system are complex system, needs also to be supported by implementation science. So we have to consider how to implement the new technology, the new drugs how to provide them in an equal, with equal opportunity, to all citizens or to all persons who need them. Finally, we should consider probably some axes in the approach we use for evaluating technology and drugs, considering this traditionally in public health, promotion, prevention, and protection are the pillars. But now we have some new, new pillars like prediction, precision, and personalized, and participation. I would like just to stress participation, that is very much important, and also the first speech of this session was very well focused on that. Finally, I would mention a colleague from Australia that reminded us since 2004 the fact that technical systems have social consequences and social systems have technical consequences. So what we design is a mix of the two. We have to consider both technical system and social consequences as a whole, trying to implement this technology together with the implementation of in the social system. And finally, we close my presentation reminding me and to all of you that all this approach, all these technologies, all in the tools like health technology assessment tools need to be inserted in the final goal, that is health and well-being, and that we have an approach One Health, and then sustainable development goal can be the final goal we have to reach. And looking at them and the ability to reach to move closer and closer to the final goal is a marker of the effectiveness and the utility of the, or usefulness, if you want, of the tools we use, the technology we discover, we make available, and the evaluation we do about their impact for our health and for our well-being. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Silvio. That was great. I loved your slides. Interesting data there. Can we have the rest of the panel now up on screen, please? And we'll start the question and answer session. So I think just waiting for Dr. Chen will be here. I've already got one question that I can kick off with. And I might as well do that because the question is for Duhan. So I'll start with you if that's okay. And the question is, from your presentation, are you suggesting that patients and clinicians should be driving what is a transformative or disruptive treatment rather than HTAi? So if you'd like to have a go at that one.
Honestly, we can. Is it okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now. Yeah, carry on.
Okay, thank you. So it's a great question. Obviously, we would love to say yes, because we believe that the closer you can get to the actual user, the more of that choice should be there. But obviously, we know, and I think as we heard from Silvio, it really is a very complex system. It's an integrated system, and no one, I think, perspective can drive it all. And if we all were driven by individual patient and clinician desires and needs, we would actually not be able to sustain all of that. Definitely, I think we're all agreeing that the patients need to be in the center. At the end of the day, if it doesn't work for the patients, if the patients aren't in agreement, they're not going to be in compliance, and nothing will work. And everything is for the benefit of the patients. But I think we're also, as patients, learning that we have to kind of be able to fit into the integrated system. And the more that systems have opened up for patient input, and certainly clinician input, I think the more we've seen balanced decision making. In the past, it's been very much driven, we believe, top down by the budgets and by the payers, and to some degree by the developers. And now, of course, it has been turned around. But so definitely we need to be part and parcel of it. We need to be a role in it. But it would be lovely if it were all driven by just patient and clinician desires and needs. But we all recognize that a whole lot of individual competing community needs, as we have seen in many instances, are not the solution. So we do need to be part of an integrated system.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely support that. It's all got to be integrated, but you mustn't forget the patient voice at the beginning, which has happened, hasn't it, sometimes. I've now got another question, a question for Silvio, if that's okay. In a complex health system with innovative technologies, is the randomized controlled trial still core for health technology assessment? So you can start, Silvio, but the others might like to come in too.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think it's one of the challenges we have in this time. Of course, you know, the colleagues who were speaking about CAR-T or other rare diseases drugs. Of course, the traditional approach is not feasible. You know, another example is about the drugs for SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. You know, we have to use some of them, even if we don't have all the traditional approach in drugs. Of course, there are some risks and we have to avoid them. But at the same time, what the need is a priority. So we have to find out the best way to do that. I think that big data or the intelligent artificial intelligence can help us. I know that there are some teams, epidemiologists working on this, trying to model alternative to that one. Of course, you know, randomized controlled trials still remain the best standard we can have. But, you know, the best sometimes is the enemy of the better. And so we have to find a way, the best way to guarantee safety for drugs, efficacy, effectiveness, if you want, of them. And safety is then the first one, surely. And but with this approach, we have to consider to invest in you know, new methods to try to get some result as soon as we can, and reliable result, of course.
Thank you. Anyone else like to contribute to that?
Well, I will, if you don't mind. Just to say that, I mean, we know, and certainly I go back to my rare diseases, the RCT has not been a standard, not been even a useful approach in many, many cases. That non-placebo, you know, single arm trial, the N of one patient, I think those have been tremendously important steps from the regulatory, from the clinical development point of view. And I think we need to recognize that in most cases, this is not going to serve increasingly where we're going, either in terms of highly more personalized kinds of therapies, where in some cases, the therapy is going to be designed for a single patient. So there is no such thing as a control. I think the idea that we've got now in terms of even in small populations, bringing them on, you know, the whole notion we used to call coverage with evidence development and now manage access are really the way into the future. How do we bring them in? How do we assess them? How do we make them available? Sometimes in a step-by-step fashion. I think what COVID's also telling us, and I love that Silvio, you really brought that center in, is that at both ends of the spectrum, highly, highly personalized, but also, you know, global, you know, pandemics, you cannot even think about the traditional RCTs. Yes, of course, for vaccine development, we're having these very large numbers, but in fact, the modifications of it are important. If we take it one step beyond, I think we certainly cannot use the traditional notion of cost effectiveness. I mean, if we were doing that, we would probably full stop and just walk away from COVID altogether. So I think it is really important that we are able to modify those kinds of methodologies that we're using.
Yeah, and Dr. Chen, anything you'd like to add? And please, to the audience out there, please send in some questions.
Okay, so thank you. Yes, I'm a level 2 and talk about the RCT during the COVID-19 in terms of China. The agency encouraged to the single arm for the real world evidence to support to the indication expanding, especially for real disease. Like the Dr. Diamond mentioned, real disease is very difficult to design the randomized control arms, very fierce population. So the agency encouraged the single arm real world data to support to get a real disease indication in China, the HTAe and Fabry disease, Gaucher's, even the very higher population. But the release a lot of guidance for the pharma industry. how to manage the real-world evidence, how to design a real-world the study to give a guidance. If they fit in the study criteria, they potentially get the indication or expanding indication, real disease and pediatric population. So that is our comments for the real disease, RTC, and university real-world evidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm told there are 2 questions in the question box, and I'm not able to see them. My question box is empty. So Denise, if you could read those out, that would be great, because I unfortunately can't see them. Lovely.
So the first question I have is, what is the role of health economists in assessing the long-term efficacy of ATMP? It cannot be solved by modelling or out of sample projection.
Thanks, Denise. So, role of health economists. Who wants to start? Sylvia, would that be something you might? I think you're on mute. At least I can't hear you.
Sorry, no, I can speak. Yes, thank you very much. I think economists are very much important, and traditionally they have. I think in the future we cannot imagine an evaluation of public health of programs of technology without having a perspective in terms of economical perspective. One thing is the perspective and understanding the impact. Another thing is the financial aspect. We should be very attentive to avoid this misunderstanding. So what we learn also from these pandemics is that probably we should accept a part of the inefficiencies in terms of financial aspect because it's protecting some way the health of the community. I'm not able to say where is the borderline of the cross-border, but we should consider the fact that probably we have to pay, a fee in terms of inefficiency or in terms of redundancies, as I mentioned in my speech. But having said that, the economical perspective, the economical impact of the technology is very much important. We should consider, and we should include almost constantly in all the evaluations.
So can I add something,
Yes,
Jillian?
please do. Yep, please.
Okay. So, I love what Silvio said, and of course, none of us can walk away from the fact that economics is a huge factor. On the other hand, I think our concern, and certainly again from a patient perspective, HTAi, as it was originally designed, really took into consideration not only economics, but societal, and took into consideration, things like the ethics. And I think what's happened and what's made it very challenging for patients, especially, and I can only speak from our perspective, is that we think HTAi has been subjugated to the economics. It's also been subjugated and subverted by the politics. And we know that in many countries where the HTAi agency serves the public payer, that the recommendations and even the analyses are very much, slanted towards kind of what that payer's, concerns are with regard to things like budget impact and not bringing back in. I mean, we fought very hard from the patient's perspective to ensure that patient views are part of it, that the societal, familial kinds of impacts are part of it, but we still find it very difficult to see how they're actually factored into some of the recommendations. And so I think this has, created a great deal of suspicion, lack of trust between the users and the agencies and the payers. So if there were a way that we could think about it in terms of it being a much more balanced, system, I think that would be hugely helpful. So yeah, of course the economics are important, but I think we've really felt that the economics and certainly the political have outweighed the other aspects of what we felt HTAi was originally intended to do.
That's really good, and that leads me into this question that I've now got in front of me that perhaps all of you would like to have a stab at. It's a question from Paul Fennessy. It says, policymakers and payers depend on health technology assessment, but disruptive technologies present challenges given the speed of development and patient demand for access. So the question is, can, should, and how So can, should, and how might HTAi evolve to better inform policy and payment decisions? The context will vary between countries, but the issues by and large will not. And from my perspective, the more that we can think about this internationally and come up with a single solution, the better. But so the question is, can, should, and how technology HTAi evolve to better inform policy and payment decisions? Sylvia first, then we'll work through that one. And this might end up being the last or the penultimate question. We'll see how quickly we go. Sylvia?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. And, depends. HTAi, of course, is a very, very important tool, giving, perspective, giving evidence, giving, horizons where to put the technology, to evaluate the technology. Then, locally, policymaker, decision maker, and then depends also on the regional aspect. In Italy, for instance, the system is very is regionalized. And other countries have a centralized system, and some are insurance-based. So the way the system, healthcare system, are financed and are organized is very much impacting on also on the use of these tools. I think that these tools should be, available all over the world. So a big agency, national agency or international agency, should provide evidences. The best with the neutral and independent assessment, and the local approach would be probably different, depending on the resources, depending on the industrial activities of the country, depending on the many factors. So what I can say, I strongly believe that we need this kind of evaluation. And I hope they are, managed at the international level with standardized approach, and probably with a common point of view on the principle or the key aspect of each technology or drugs. But then I think that locally, nationally, probably the evaluation would differ a little bit according to different aspects that we cannot we never control completely, I would say. Certainly, patients have a strong role because they are the final users and the final goal for this technology, and probably their opinion overall in a system moving towards a personalized approach. Patient perspective would be very much important.
Thank you. That's great. Dr. Chen, just there's a question for you here. It talks about the CAR therapies, and the question is, what are the wider effects of these technologies, for instance, in terms of opportunity, cost, ethical, social, and organizational impacts? Just wondered if you had any quick thoughts on that, and I'm aware we're almost out of time, so we had better conclude, but if you could reflect on that wider impacts.
Okay, thank you for your question. It's a great question. In China, the CAR T is clinical trial is very popular, mostly sponsored by the hospital institution, because they are CAR T. I mentioned to you because they are very high cost, and sometimes the safety profile is not so good. Response is very promising, but how to use clinical practice is a very key issue in China. So in the pharma industry, also the investigator trying to find another solution, potentially, and the CAR NK I presented today is maybe the one of a solution, because off a shelf can be big manufactured, easy, and lower price can be benefit to all the patient in the future and low price. So that is, I think, the HTAi and the encouraging a lot of innovative way to benefit the patient, especially for the cancer patient. That is very difficult issue in China.
Thank you for that. I think the sign of successful event like this is that there are more questions than time, and that is indeed where we've ended up. There are some additional questions in the question box, but I know everyone has busy lives and other things to get to, so I will conclude at this point and say thank you to the three presenters for some fascinating insights and some really challenging questions. And I feel as though we've only skimmed the surface of some of these issues because there's such a lot to think about. So hopefully at some point soon we'll all be able to get together in a room and talk about this, but for the moment it's been great and well done. It's not the easiest, so thanks to you and thank you to the audience.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.